It was just another Sunday afternoon when I stumbled into a conversation that would change everything I thought I knew about history, race, and the Bible. I was sitting with some friends, casually scrolling through social media, when someone brought up the curse of Ham. One of them said, "You know that's the reason black people are cursed, right? It's in the Bible." I froze. I'd heard whispers of this before, but I never really dug into it. Something about that statement didn't sit right with me. I looked around the room. Half the people nodded like it was common knowledge, and the other half looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. That moment sparked something in me. A question that kept echoing in my mind. Are black people really cursed by God? And if so, where did that idea come from? This video isn't just about a verse in the Bible. It's about untangling a mystery that's been passed down for generations. One that's shaped how people see themselves and each other. It's about uncovering how an ancient story has been used, twisted, and misunderstood to justify oppression, slavery, and racism. We're going deep into one of the most controversial and misinterpreted parts of the Bible, the story of Noah, his son Ham, and a curse that was never meant to be what people claimed it was. This isn't about attacking anyone's faith or stirring up hate. It's about truth. It's about asking the questions that matter, even if they make us uncomfortable. You might be wondering, what exactly is the curse of Ham? Why does this one line in the Bible carry so much weight? And how did it end up being connected to black people at all? Well, that's where the story gets wild. Because what the Bible actually says and what history and culture did with those words are two very different things. And the more you dig, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just a religious question. It's a human story. A story about power, identity, and the stories people tell to keep other people in chains. Let's rewind to the beginning. In the book of Genesis, after the great flood, Noah plants a vineyard, gets drunk, and ends up lying naked in his tent. His son Ham sees him, and something happens, something that's been debated for centuries. Ham tells his brothers, who respectfully cover their father. When Noah wakes up and finds out what happened, he curses not Ham, but Ham's son, Canaan. That's it. That's the moment. No mention of skin color. No mention of Africa. No mention of a curse being passed down to an entire race of people. And yet, somehow, over time, this passage was used to justify the brutal enslavement of millions of Africans. How? That's the heart of this mystery. Somewhere along the way, people started connecting Ham's descendants with black Africans. The theory was that Ham moved to Africa, so his descendants must have been black. And because Canaan was cursed, that must mean all black people were cursed. But wait, if you actually read the Bible, Ham had 4 sons, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Cush settled in Ethiopia. Mizraim became Egypt. Put was linked to Libya. And Canaan? Canaan settled in the land that would later become Israel and Palestine, not sub-Saharan Africa. So how did a curse meant for one son, in one region, become a label stamped on an entire race of people? Here's where things start to get uncomfortable. Over the centuries, certain groups, especially during the transatlantic slave trade, used this story to create a theological defense for slavery. They took that curse, added their own interpretations, and preached it from pulpits. They said God had ordained black people to be servants, that it was divine punishment, that it was part of the natural order. And the worst part? A lot of people believed it. Some still do. But when you look closely at the actual scripture, you realize it doesn't say anything close to that. The Bible never says Ham was cursed. It never says his skin was dark. It never says his descendants were all doomed. The so-called curse of Ham is actually a curse on Canaan, and even that was more about dishonor and family betrayal than race or skin color. But history has a way of bending truth to fit the needs of power. And for those who wanted to justify slavery, the curse of Ham was the perfect tool. A few lines of scripture, twisted just enough, could create centuries of injustice. But this story isn't just about what people did in the past. It's about the impact those ideas still have today. That myth, that lie, has shaped how black people are seen and how they see themselves. It's shown up in school books, sermons, casual conversations, and even in the way some churches talk about sin and suffering. And whether we realize it or not, those old ideas still linger in our culture like smoke from a fire that never quite went out. So what does the Bible really say? What did Noah mean when he cursed Canaan? Was it a divine punishment or a personal reaction? Were there political or tribal implications hidden in that moment? And most importantly, how do we untangle the truth from the lies we've been told for generations? In this series, we're going to walk through it all, from Genesis to modern-day theology. We'll look at ancient languages, cultural contexts, and historical records. We'll talk to Bible scholars, historians, and everyday people who've wrestled with this question. And along the way, we're going to challenge some assumptions, maybe even some of your own. Because the truth is, once you start asking questions, the story looks very different. And here's the thing. This isn't just about proving people wrong. It's about setting people free. Free from the guilt, the shame, the false doctrine, and the internalized pain that comes from being told you're cursed by God because of who you are. It's about reclaiming the truth and restoring dignity where it was stolen. So, if you've ever heard someone say black people are cursed, if you've ever wondered where that idea came from, if you've ever struggled with the tension between faith and identity, or if you're just curious to see what the Bible actually says, then stay with me. Because we're about to dig deeper than most people ever dare to go. But just when we think we've found some answers, when the fog starts to lift, something happens that turns everything upside down. A buried clue in the ancient text. A word mistranslated. A forgotten piece of history hidden in plain sight. And suddenly, we realize we may have been asking the wrong question this whole time. So don't go anywhere. Because what comes next might change everything you thought you knew about faith, race, and the curse that was never meant to be. It started with a name. Canaan. That's who Noah cursed. Not Ham, not Cush, not Mizraim. Just Canaan. But why? Why single out one grandson when the father was the one who walked into that tent? That question alone has kept scholars arguing for centuries. Some say it was prophetic, others say it was symbolic. But one thing is clear, there was something deeper going on beneath the surface. Something that doesn't add up if you take the story at face value. See, Canaan wasn't even the firstborn. He wasn't the one who saw Noah in his shame. So the curse feels strange, unfair even. And when you follow Canaan's story forward, it leads to some of the Bible's biggest battles. The land of Canaan becomes the promised land, but also a place of conquest, struggle, and spiritual testing for the people of Israel. So was the curse about race? Or was it about territory, prophecy, and legacy? As we dig deeper, we start to see how this one moment, Noah's drunkenness, Ham's mistake, Canaan's curse, became the seed for a much bigger narrative. Over time, people started to assign colors and locations to the sons of Noah. Shem was said to be the ancestor of the Semitic people, Jews and Arabs. Japheth was said to represent Europeans. And Ham? Ham became linked with Africa. But none of that is written explicitly in the Bible. It came later, from interpretations, traditions, and eventually agendas. That's where things get blurry. Because somewhere between the written word and how it was taught, the curse of Canaan became the curse of Ham. And the curse of Ham became a justification for slavery. Not because the Bible said so, but because it was convenient. If you could point to a scripture, any scripture, and say, look, God said this, then you could defend anything. You could build systems. You could pass laws. You could break people and still sleep at night. And here's the part most people don't realize. This wasn't just a European idea. Over time, this belief crept into churches around the world. It became embedded in doctrine. It shaped art, sermons, textbooks, and even how people prayed. In the American South during slavery, preachers stood in front of congregations and quoted the so-called curse of Ham as if it were gospel truth. They used it to teach obedience, to keep people in chains, physically and mentally. And even after slavery ended, the shadow of that lie lingered. It fed into segregation, into stereotypes, into that low, aching feeling that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong with being black. But here's the twist. When you go back to ancient Hebrew texts, the word Ham doesn't even mean black the way many people think. Yes, the name has been associated with hot or burnt, and some scholars believe there's a connection to Egypt or Ethiopia. But none of that proves Ham was black. And more importantly, it doesn't prove that he or his descendants were cursed. And yet the idea stuck, like a stain on history that won't wash off. Because once something becomes a part of culture, even if it's wrong, it's hard to erase. It becomes legend, myth, and people don't question myths if they've been hearing them since childhood. So we're left with this uncomfortable reality that a misreading of a few ancient words helped create one of the biggest lies in human history. That black people are cursed, that their suffering is divine punishment, that they were meant to serve. And what's even more disturbing is how many people still believe it, or act like they do, even if they don't say it out loud. I remember talking to someone not long ago who said, well, maybe it's true in a spiritual sense. Like, maybe black people are under some kind of generational curse. And I just looked at them, not because I was offended, but because I realized how deep this lie runs. How even people who don't mean harm still carry the weight of this false teaching. It's like a ghost that haunts everything, even now. So let's go back again. Let's look at what the text actually says. When Noah wakes up from his drunken sleep, he knows what his youngest son had done to him. He doesn't curse Ham directly. He curses Ham's son. And scholars have debated what that done to him really means. Was it just disrespect? Was it something more serious? Some ancient commentaries suggest it was symbolic, about future nations, not individuals. Others say it was personal, rooted in family shame and honor. But whatever it was never about race. And that's what makes this whole thing even more tragic. Because the Bible doesn't support racism. It never has. If anything, the Bible constantly talks about justice, equality, love, and mercy. Jesus himself spent time with people from every background: Jews, Samaritans, Romans, Ethiopians. The early church was diverse. Acts chapter 8 even tells the story of an Ethiopian man, a royal official, who became one of the first known Christians. That's not the story of a cursed people. That's a story of dignity and calling. But the curse myth was louder than truth, louder than love. It echoed through history like a drumbeat. And when people repeated it enough times, it started to feel real, even when it wasn't. There's another part of this that adds more confusion. Some old maps and writings began to place Ham's descendants all over Africa. They'd label places like Egypt and Ethiopia as Hamite territories. And as colonial powers moved across Africa, they used those maps as tools. They turned biblical genealogy into a blueprint for domination. And if someone resisted, they'd point to the curse. This is your fate. This is your place. Imagine being a child and hearing that your skin color was tied to a curse. Imagine growing up believing that your ancestors were doomed because of something written thousands of years ago, something they had no control over. That kind of message doesn't just wound. It shapes identity. It creates fear, shame, silence. And yet, people carried it, quietly, because challenging it meant challenging the church, challenging what had been passed down. And for many, that wasn't allowed. But not everyone accepted it. Over time, brave voices began to speak out. Black theologians, historians, pastors. They started asking hard questions, digging into the text, telling the truth. They reminded the world that the Bible, in its purest form, was never a weapon against people. It was a story of redemption. And that redemption was for everyone, no matter their color, their lineage, or their past. Still, the damage had been done. And for a lot of people, it still feels like the curse never really left. Not because it's true, but because the world has treated them like it is. Like they're still wearing a mark they never asked for. And just when it seems like we're starting to make sense of it all, when we finally begin separating truth from myth, we find something else. An ancient manuscript, a forgotten commentary, a linguistic clue buried in the original Hebrew. And suddenly, the story takes a sharp turn. A revelation that changes everything. A question rises from the dust of old texts and twisted interpretations. What if the curse wasn't about race or even Canaan, but something much bigger? Something hidden? Something that's been right in front of us all along? We're about to find out. But be warned, this next part might shake everything you thought you knew. As I delved deeper into the story of Noah, Ham, and the curse, I started to realize something unsettling. The more I researched, the more I came across contradictions, half-truths, and deliberate omissions. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding that led to the curse of Ham myth. It was something more insidious. It was a distortion of a narrative carefully shaped to serve specific agendas. And that's where the real conflict lay. At first, I thought this was just about a bad translation or maybe some historical misunderstanding. But then I started reading more. I found passages that seemed to hint at something much darker. Some scholars argue that the curse of Canaan wasn't just about a family dispute. It was a theological declaration about the future of entire nations. If that's true, then it wasn't just a matter of misreading a few lines. It was about power, legacy, and the manipulation of Scripture to control people, something that stretches far beyond ancient texts and spills into the present day. The deeper I went, the more I began to see how this myth had become an anchor for centuries of colonialism, exploitation, and racial oppression. It was a tale woven into the fabric of history, a story used to justify violence, to hold entire people groups in subjugation. This wasn't some random error. It was a calculated move to divide, to silence, and to create an us versus them mentality that still echoes in the language and politics of today. But why, I asked myself, did the curse of Ham take root so strongly in the first place? What made it so powerful that it became the foundation for centuries of racial discrimination? That's when I stumbled upon a perspective I had never considered before. Some historians believe that this belief didn't just pop up because of the Bible's words. It was a reaction to economic and social forces. In other words, the people who wielded the Bible during the early days of the Atlantic slave trade found it convenient to use the curse of Ham as a theological excuse for enslaving Africans. They weren't interested in interpreting Scripture for truth. They were interested in legitimizing their actions. And when I thought about it like that, I realized something even more disturbing. The curse wasn't just a matter of race. It was a way to establish control. It was about creating a justification for the inhumane treatment of an entire people group. If you could convince people that Black Africans were cursed, it gave you an excuse to treat them as less than human. It allowed people to dehumanize them, to strip away their rights, and to claim their labor as something ordained by God. But even in the midst of this dark history, there were voices that resisted. Voices from within the Black community, from abolitionists, from religious leaders, and even from scholars who refused to let the myth stand unchallenged. These were the people who, despite the weight of history pressing down on them, stood firm in their faith, in their identity, and in their belief that God had never cursed anyone based on the color of their skin. They fought back against the narrative that had been forced upon them. They found their own truths, their own power, even in the face of centuries of oppression. Still, there was something about the idea of a curse that fascinated me. Why would the concept of a curse be so deeply tied to race in the first place? The more I thought about it, the more I saw parallels between the biblical story and the way modern society still treats race today. The idea of a curse, something passed down, something inherited, something that can never be escaped, has a power all its own. It's a tool that's used not only to control, but also to limit. To say, this is who you are. You can't change it. It's the ultimate label, one that leaves people feeling trapped, as if their fate is sealed before they even have a chance to live their lives. And that's the thing. The curse wasn't just an ancient story. It was a living, breathing force in the lives of Black people for hundreds of years. They grew up hearing it, seeing it reflected in laws, in books, in their interactions with society. Every time they were denied an opportunity, every time they were treated with disrespect, they were reminded of the curse. It wasn't enough to simply accept their place in society. They had to carry the weight of a history that told them they were lesser, that their struggles weren't just a matter of circumstance, but of divine design. But as the story continued to unfold, I began to uncover something unexpected. Not all of history had been shaped by the curse of Ham myth. In fact, there were places where this idea never took root, where Black people were not seen through the lens of a curse, but through the lens of strength, resilience, and dignity. And that's where the conflict took a new turn. It wasn't just about a lie that had been passed down. It was about the stories of resistance and survival that had existed right alongside it. Take the African spiritual traditions that survived the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. Many enslaved Africans held on to their faiths, blending them with Christianity in ways that created a new, unique form of worship and cultural identity. Despite being told they were cursed, they created vibrant communities, forged powerful spiritual movements, and fought for their freedom. The fact that they survived and thrived in the face of oppression proves that the curse didn't have the power that people thought it did. If anything, it was the spirit of resilience, of rebellion, and of faith that had been passed down through generations. And yet, the myth of the curse wasn't easily erased. It's still there, lurking in the background of many conversations, still affecting the way people view Black history and Black identity. When I looked at the ongoing struggles for racial equality, the rise of systemic racism, and the subtle yet powerful ways Black people are still marginalized today, I began to see how deep the roots of this myth had grown. It wasn't just about the Bible anymore. It was about the stories people tell, the histories they keep alive, and the messages they continue to pass on. But as I continued my journey through this tangled web of history and theology, one thing became clearer. The truth was never as simple as a curse. And the more I dug into the story of Ham, Noah, and the curse, the more I began to wonder if there were still hidden layers waiting to be uncovered. Was the real story something even darker, even more complex? Was there a deeper conspiracy within the Bible itself that had been carefully buried to maintain power and control? The tension in the story only grew with each revelation. I could feel the weight of history pressing in on me. Every time I thought I was getting closer to the truth, the story twisted again, leading me down another path I wasn't prepared for. But I knew one thing for certain. The deeper I went, the more I realized that the truth behind the curse of Ham was far from over. It was still being written, and that, somehow, made the story even more compelling. As I continued my deep dive into the story of Noah, Ham, and the so-called curse, the questions kept piling up. The more I uncovered, the more layers seemed to peel back, each one revealing new contradictions, new mysteries, and new stories that begged to be told. But the more I unearthed, the heavier the weight of this history became. It wasn't just an ancient story anymore. It wasn't just about a few lines of scripture or a theological misunderstanding. This was about something far more dangerous, something that had taken on a life of its own, infecting generations and shaping the very way people saw the world. It became impossible to ignore the echoes of this myth in the present. The more I researched, the more I started seeing how the curse of Ham wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive and well, still being used in subtle ways to justify systems of inequality and division. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an academic debate. This was personal. This was about people's lives. This was about history that still held people in its grip, a history that defined the lives of millions, even today. And there was one piece of the puzzle that kept haunting me. A phrase, almost forgotten, buried deep in ancient texts, that seemed to hold the key to everything. It was the phrase that Noah spoke after waking from his drunken stupor. "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." A servant of servants. For generations, this phrase had been twisted and warped. It had been used to justify the degradation of an entire people, to create the idea that Black people were doomed to be slaves forever. But what if that wasn't what Noah meant at all? What if there was something deeper, something more hidden in that seemingly innocuous line? I couldn't let go of it. The more I read, the more it seemed like this one phrase held all the power to shape nations, to define identities, to justify atrocities. It wasn't just a curse. It was a declaration, a prophecy, something that had been manipulated over centuries to serve a purpose. The more I looked into it, the more the story began to feel like a trap, one that had been set long before anyone realized it. A trap that, once set, could ensnare anyone who came close enough. As I pieced together the puzzle, I couldn't help but wonder, was this curse real, or was it all part of a grand design? The more I studied history, the more it seemed like the myth of the curse of Ham was deliberately woven into the fabric of colonialism. How else could you explain the way it was used so efficiently to justify slavery? How else could you explain how a simple Bible story could become the cornerstone of an entire system that lasted for hundreds of years? But the deeper I dug, the more unsettling things became. I found old manuscripts, long-forgotten writings, that suggested the curse wasn't as clear-cut as people thought. There were scholars who had once tried to separate the curse from race altogether, arguing that it had more to do with geography and culture than skin color. Yet, the narrative kept shifting. It kept changing to fit whatever story those in power needed to tell. Was it possible that the real story had been lost, covered up by those who had a stake in keeping people enslaved and subjugated? I kept coming back to that same line. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be. Could it be that the curse wasn't about race at all? Could it be that the curse was never meant to affect entire peoples, but rather specific individuals or nations? And if that were true, then what had happened over the centuries to make it a justification for the horrors of slavery and racism? Had the story itself been hijacked by those with their own agendas? Or was there something hidden in the text that had been waiting all along to be uncovered? Every time I felt like I was getting closer to an answer, something would stop me. A contradiction in the texts, a cultural misunderstanding, a missing link in the historical record. And with each dead end, I felt the tension rise. What was I missing? Why did this story still hold so much power? I decided to take one last step, something I hadn't done before. I reached out to scholars, theologians, historians, people who had dedicated their lives to studying these texts and the history surrounding them. I was desperate for answers, desperate to understand how such a powerful myth could have been built on such shaky ground. One scholar in particular stood out to me. She had spent years researching the intersection of race, theology, and colonialism. When I spoke to her about the curse of Ham and its implications, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that sent chills down my spine. The problem with the curse of Ham myth is that it's not just in the Bible. It's been woven into the fabric of Western thought, Western law, Western identity. And in order to undo it, you have to rewrite the very foundation of what we believe about ourselves. I didn't fully understand at first, but as we continued talking, I began to see what she meant. The myth wasn't just an isolated issue. It was part of a much larger narrative, a narrative that had been passed down through generations, shaped, refined, and manipulated until it became part of the very air we breathe. The curse of Ham wasn't just a theological error. It was a cornerstone of a worldview. It was a way of seeing the world that justified exploitation, inequality, and division. And undoing that worldview would mean undoing centuries of ingrained belief. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how far-reaching the effects of this myth were. It wasn't just something that affected theology or history. It was something that had shaped people's minds, their ideas about race, their ideas about hierarchy. And here I was, trying to uncover the truth, trying to peel back the layers of this myth that had been built so carefully over centuries. But was I too late? Could the truth ever truly be untangled from the lies that have been told for so long? The tension in the air was palpable now. Every piece of evidence I uncovered seemed to raise more questions than answers. I was getting closer, I could feel it. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I realized the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. The curse of Ham wasn't just a religious misunderstanding. It was a battle for identity, a battle for freedom, and a battle for the very soul of humanity. And just when I thought I might be on the verge of cracking the mystery wide open, I found something that sent everything spiraling into chaos. An ancient manuscript, one that had been hidden away for centuries, was discovered in a forgotten library. It was a text that had been suppressed, locked away because it held a truth that no one wanted to face. It was the missing piece, the final puzzle piece, and it was about to change everything. But what I discovered in that manuscript was so shocking, so earth-shattering, that I wasn't sure if I could even process it. The truth I was chasing was far darker than I ever could have imagined. And now, with everything I thought I knew on the line, the only question left was, could I bring this truth to light before it was buried once more? As I carefully examined the ancient manuscript, my hands trembling slightly, I began to realize that what I was holding wasn't just another piece of forgotten history. It was a bombshell. The text was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was a forgotten commentary on the curse of Ham, but not one that had ever been made public. This manuscript was written centuries ago by a group of scholars who had dared to question everything the church had ever told them. They believed that the curse wasn't a punishment at all, but a warning, a prophetic vision about the dangers of how power would be misused by future generations. It was almost too much to take in at once. What these scholars had written was chilling. They described how the curse of Ham had been intentionally misinterpreted to serve a greater agenda, one that wasn't just about race, but about control. They suggested that the real story behind the curse was far more complex than anyone had realized. It wasn't about God cursing a race. It was about the corrupting influence of power itself, and how certain people throughout history would twist divine words to justify their own domination. And those words, the manuscript said, were never meant to be applied to any one people. The curse was not about skin color. It was about greed, about the abuse of power, and about the manipulation of Scripture to build empires. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the manuscript went even further. It seemed to suggest that the very myth of the curse of Ham was created to cover up something darker, something far more sinister, something hidden at the heart of human history. The truth, according to these ancient scholars, was that the curse had always been about the elite, those in positions of power, who, throughout history, have sought to keep the truth buried to maintain control over the masses. They claimed that the story had been deliberately warped by religious leaders and political powers, not as a matter of theology, but as a strategy to create division, to keep one group of people in servitude, and to manipulate the masses into believing that their fate had been sealed by God. That revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. Everything I'd been taught, everything I'd thought I understood about the curse of Ham, had been wrong. I realized now that the conflict wasn't just about race. It was about something more insidious. The curse had been weaponized, distorted into a tool for controlling entire populations. And the manipulation of that myth hadn't just lasted a few centuries. It had seeped into the very foundations of Western civilization. The power of the myth was in how deeply it had taken root in the minds of people all over the world. It wasn't just about a few ancient texts anymore. It was about the world we live in today. But before I could fully process what I had uncovered, I stumbled upon something that shook me even further. As I scrolled through the manuscript's footnotes, I found a reference to a secret meeting, a gathering of powerful religious and political leaders from centuries ago, people who had known about the true meaning of the curse and had made a deliberate decision to distort its interpretation for their own gain. The manuscript didn't go into full detail, but the mention of this meeting seemed too significant to ignore. It was almost like a hidden history, an underground conspiracy that had shaped the very world we live in today. Could it be that the entire narrative surrounding the curse of Ham, the idea of black people being cursed by God, had been deliberately created not just for spiritual manipulation, but for political power? Was it possible that this distortion of Scripture had been used to justify not only slavery, but also entire systems of inequality, oppression, and racism that had stretched through history like a shadow, always lurking, always present? I couldn't just let it go. I had to find out more about this secret meeting, this gathering of powerful figures who had, according to the manuscript, decided the fate of entire nations. It felt like I had unearthed a hidden thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of history. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that what I was about to uncover could have enormous consequences, not just for my understanding of the curse, but for everything I had ever been taught about history, power, and the way the world operates. As I began tracking down clues about this meeting, I realized that I wasn't the only one searching for the truth. There were others too. People who had been investigating these same texts, these same conspiracies. Some of them were scholars, some were activists, and some were even individuals with hidden motives who were just as interested in the truth as they were in keeping the truth buried. The deeper I went, the more I realized that I was walking a fine line. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous this journey became. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. The truth I was searching for wasn't just some academic curiosity. It was something that could change everything. It could change the way people viewed their history, their identity, and their place in the world. It could challenge everything we thought we knew about race, power, and even religion. But if I exposed the truth, would it cause more harm than good? Would it ignite a fire that could never be put out? And then, just when I thought I was close, so close to unraveling the full story, I was faced with an unexpected and terrifying twist. Someone, or something, didn't want me to continue. I began receiving strange warnings, anonymous letters, cryptic phone calls, and subtle threats that made me question whether I was uncovering something I wasn't meant to. Was this just a coincidence? Or was someone actively trying to stop me from getting too close to the truth? The tension reached its peak when I received an encrypted message late one night. The message was brief, but chilling. You're digging in places you shouldn't be. Stop now, or you'll regret it. The words felt like a direct threat, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I knew I was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that could finally lay to rest the lies that had been told for centuries. But now the stakes were higher than ever. I had to decide. Do I keep pushing forward, knowing that my pursuit of the truth might destroy everything? Or do I back off, letting the lies live on, unanswered, buried in the dark? The decision weighed heavily on me as I prepared to dive deeper into the mystery, into the conspiracy, and into the very heart of the curse of Ham. One thing was clear: the closer I got, the more dangerous this journey became. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I was about to uncover next. The fear in my gut hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only grown stronger the deeper I dug into the mystery surrounding the curse of Ham. The threats, the cryptic messages, they were all pointing in one direction. Someone didn't want me to uncover the truth. But I couldn't turn back now. I had already come too far. I had to push through to confront whatever dark force was trying to suppress this story. I finally tracked down the location of the secret meeting mentioned in the manuscript, the place where the powerful figures had gathered centuries ago to rewrite the meaning of the curse. It wasn't just some dusty old historical artifact. It was still alive in the world today, buried beneath layers of history and deception. I had to go to the place where it all started. I had to find a key to unlocking everything. It led me to a crumbling archive in a forgotten part of the world. The place was almost hidden, tucked away behind layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. I managed to gain access under the guise of research, but it felt like I was walking into a trap. As soon as I entered the room, the air felt heavier. It wasn't just the musty smell of old books or the faded papers. There was a sense that something important, something dangerous, had been hidden in this place for centuries. I started sifting through the documents, my heart racing as I found what I was looking for. There it was, the meeting. A small group of influential individuals, ranging from religious leaders to colonial powers, had gathered and devised a plan to manipulate the curse of Ham myth. But what shocked me was that this wasn't just a casual decision made for convenience. It was part of something much larger, something even more sinister. The document revealed how they had engineered entire systems of control, from slavery to colonialism, using the myth to justify their actions. But they didn't stop there. The curse, as it turned out, had been just the beginning of a deeper conspiracy, a plan to create a narrative that would define not just race, but global power dynamics for centuries to come. It was a long game of control, played out over generations, and it was clear now that those who manipulated the myth of the curse were playing for far higher stakes than I had ever imagined. It hit me all at once. This wasn't just about race or theology. This was about power. The manipulation of the curse wasn't just a mistake or an accident. It was a calculated, deliberate effort to shape the world. These individuals have been working behind the scenes, using religion, politics, and social constructs to rewrite history, creating systems of oppression that still exist today. This was the heart of the darkness I had been chasing, the thing that had been hidden for centuries. But just as I thought I had uncovered the full story, I found something else, something that turned everything on its head. A hidden letter tucked away in the back of the archive from one of the very figures who had been involved in the original meeting. It was addressed to someone named the Keeper, a title I had never heard before. The letter hinted at a deeper secret, one that had been passed down for generations, a secret that could shatter everything I had just uncovered. The letter revealed that the curse wasn't the only story that had been manipulated. There was another, far more ancient narrative buried beneath layers of distortion and deceit, one that had been hidden not by colonial powers or religious leaders, but by a group of individuals whose very existence was a secret. They were the keepers of truth, an underground order who had worked for centuries to ensure that the truth of the curse of Ham and the secret surrounding it would never be revealed. But now, it seemed their time was running out. The letter warned that the truth could only be exposed once the final key had been found, and it hinted that the key had already been in my possession all along. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The final key wasn't just some artifact I had been searching for. It was the very act of telling the story. I had uncovered the myth, the distortion, the conspiracy. But in order to truly break the cycle, to free the world from the grip of the lies that had been built around the curse of Ham, I had to expose it to the light. The truth wasn't just hidden in ancient texts or forgotten manuscripts. It was hidden in plain sight, in the very telling of the story itself. By sharing what I had learned, by revealing the extent of the manipulation, I could take back the power from those who had used it for so long. But before I could process the magnitude of this revelation, I heard a sound behind me. I froze. I wasn't alone. Someone else was in the archive with me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just the darkness, the echo of footsteps, and a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. I knew then that the battle was far from over. As I made my way back out of the archive, a sense of urgency washed over me. The final twist wasn't just about what I had uncovered. It was about the forces that still wanted to keep the truth buried. I had exposed the manipulation of history, but there were still those who would stop at nothing to maintain the power that had been built on lies. The people who had engineered this conspiracy, who had shaped the course of history, weren't ready to let go. In the final moments of my journey, I came face to face with someone I hadn't expected, a figure who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. There was someone I had encountered earlier in my search, someone whose cryptic messages and warnings had seemed so harmless at the time. But now I saw the truth. The person standing before me wasn't just a bystander. They were the keeper. The figure smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You were never meant to find this," they said, their voice soft but filled with an undeniable menace. "But now that you have, it's too late to turn back. You've unlocked something that can never be closed again." And just like that, I realized the fight wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The secrets I had uncovered, the truths I had exposed, would reverberate through history in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. But the one thing I knew for certain was that the curse of Ham, the story that had shaped so much of the world's history, was finally ready to be rewritten. And the truth, no matter how dangerous it was out there now, waiting for the world to face it. But as for me, I was left to wonder if I had the strength to see this through, or if the forces I had uncovered would destroy everything I had worked so hard to uncover. The figure before me, the keeper, stood silent for a moment, as if weighing my reaction. The air between us crackled with a tension I couldn't escape, the weight of everything I had uncovered pressing down on me. I realized then that this was the final test, the last step in a long journey that had led me here, to this moment. The keeper wasn't just some shadowy figure in a forgotten archive. They were the embodiment of everything I had fought to understand, the darkness that had twisted history and shaped the world in ways I could never have imagined. But I refused to back down. I'd already come too far to let this be the end of the story. What do you want from me? I asked, trying to steady my voice. I knew this was a turning point. Everything I had uncovered, the manipulation of the curse of Ham, the hidden meetings, the centuries of deception, had led me to this confrontation. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, with no idea what would happen when I took the next step. The keeper's smile deepened, and they took a slow step toward me. It's not about what I want, they said softly. It's about what's already been set in motion. You've uncovered the truth, but the truth is a double-edged sword. Once the veil is lifted, you can never put it back down. I felt a chill run down my spine as they spoke. The weight of their words settled over me like a shroud, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what was coming next. But then, something inside me stirred. I had come this far for a reason. I had unearthed these truths because I believed that people deserved to know the real story, not the twisted version that had been told for centuries. The curse of Ham wasn't just a myth. It was a tool of manipulation, a false narrative that had been used to justify the suffering of millions. And now that I knew the truth, there was no turning back. Maybe the veil can't be put back down, I said, my voice steadying. But that doesn't mean we can't change what comes next. For a moment, the keeper didn't respond. Their eyes studied me, calculating, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort. I stood my ground, refusing to show fear. The truth was now in my hands, and there was no force that could take it from me. I had exposed the lies that had shaped history, but now it was time to take that knowledge and turn it into something powerful, something that could undo the damage that had been done. The keeper let out a soft sigh, almost as if they were resigned to the inevitability of the moment. You're right, they said, their voice tinged with something that could almost be described as admiration. The truth always comes out eventually, but it's not always easy to live with. I nodded. I understood that better than anyone. The truth wasn't always a comfort. Sometimes it was painful. Sometimes it shattered everything you thought you knew. But I had learned over the course of this journey that the only way forward was to embrace it, to face the darkness and step into the light. The keeper took a step back and then turned away, as if signaling the end of our conversation. You've done what few others would have dared, they said, their voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable finality. Now it's up to you what happens next. And just like that, they were gone, disappearing into the shadows as silently as they had come. I stood there alone, processing everything I'd learned. The secrets, the lies, the conspiracy, it was all laid bare before me. But I couldn't help but feel that this wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of the story, and it wasn't the end of my journey. The truth had been revealed, yes, but there was still so much work to be done. I walked out of the archive, the weight of what I had uncovered settling heavily on my shoulders. But there was something else too, something lighter, something that came with the knowledge that I had exposed the darkness, that I had uncovered the lies. The world had been manipulated for so long, but now, with the truth in the open, things could begin to change. In the weeks that followed, the information I had gathered started to make waves. Scholars, activists, and even ordinary people began to dig deeper into the historical manipulation of the curse of Ham. The truth spread, like wildfire, through the halls of academia, through social media, through communities that had long been affected by the consequences of the myth. The revelations shook the foundations of the systems that had perpetuated the lie for centuries. But it wasn't just about exposing the past. It was about what came next. People began to ask questions. They began to challenge the narratives that had been imposed upon them. And slowly, change started to happen. Conversations that had once been impossible to have were now taking place. People were reckoning with their histories, their identities, and their roles in shaping the future. There was one thing that I couldn't stop thinking about, though, the letter from the keeper. It had hinted at something far deeper, something still hidden beneath the surface. The truth I had uncovered was powerful, but it was only the beginning. The question now was what we would do with it. The world had been shaped by these myths for so long, but if we were truly to move forward, we had to start rewriting the narrative together. As I reflected on everything I'd learned, I realized that this story wasn't just mine to tell. It belonged to everyone. The struggle to reclaim the truth, to reshape history, wasn't one person's battle. It was a collective effort. And in that realization, I found a sense of peace. I had uncovered the truth, yes, but the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. We may never fully undo the damage done by the manipulation of the curse of Ham, but we could rewrite the story. We could break free from the shackles of the past and create a future where truth, equality, and justice could thrive. And that, I realized, was the most powerful thing of all. The ability to change the narrative, to take back the power that had been stolen from us, and to shape the world into something better for future generations. The final twist wasn't just about the Keeper's hidden role or the conspiracy I had uncovered. It was about the realization that we all held the key to breaking the cycle. The past had shaped us, but it didn't have to define us. And as I looked out at the world, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, a sense that, together, we could finally begin to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by the lies of the past. The story wasn't over, and the truth had just begun to take root.